Whitney Davis had been invisible for 3 years at the Azure Pearl, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. The 28-year-old black server knew which tables to avoid, and Richard Thornton's white billionaire table topped that list. Then his son started dancing. Daniel, 8 years old, autistic, suddenly perked up when the jazz pianist began playing. Without warning, the boy bolted from his father's table and started moving to the music. His hands flapped wildly, his body spun in circles. He jumped and swayed with pure, unself-conscious joy. He ran to Whitney, grabbed her hands, and pulled her into his dance. Whitney froze for only a second. Then something in Daniel's delight broke through her caution. She began moving with him, gentle spins, soft swaying, mirroring his unconventional rhythm. The boy's face lit up with the brightest smile. 15 seconds of connection, 15 seconds of a child finally being met where he was. Then Richard Thornton's voice exploded. "Get your hands off my son!" 200 guests stared at the black woman dancing with the white billionaire's disabled child. "People like you should know your place. Have you ever been judged for showing kindness?" The Azure Pearl wasn't just a restaurant. It was a temple of wealth perched on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper where the elite paid $500 per plate to be photographed doing charity. Tonight's gala, ostensibly for children with disabilities, had drawn 200 of New York's wealthiest donors, people who wrote checks with more zeros than most Americans saw in a lifetime. Whitney Davis had learned to navigate this world by becoming invisible. At 28, she'd perfected the art of anticipating needs before they were voiced, of keeping her dark eyes cast downward, of moving through rooms without disturbing the air. Her lean frame in its pressed uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her neutral expression, all carefully constructed to avoid attention. She'd worked here for 3 years, long enough to know the hierarchy of tables. Table 1 was always reserved for Richard Thornton. Richard Thornton, 55, was the kind of wealthy that felt inevitable. Silver hair perfectly styled, custom Italian suit that cost more than Whitney's annual salary, and the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. He'd built his billions in real estate, constructing luxury developments that displaced working-class families and called it urban renewal. His charitable foundation had donated $2 million to special needs programs, a tax write-off that came with excellent publicity. But Whitney had served him dozens of times. She'd watched how he treated staff. She'd heard his jokes about certain people and those neighborhoods. She'd seen the contempt beneath the philanthropist mask. Most painfully, she'd watched how he treated his own son. Daniel Thornton sat beside his father but existed in a completely different world. The 8-year-old had sandy blonde hair that fell into his eyes and wore a small suit that made him look like a miniature adult. While other children at the gala ran and played, Daniel sat rigid, hands gripping his chair, eyes unfocused on the middle distance. He was autistic, nonverbal most of the time, overwhelmed by the noise, the lights, the crush of people. Whitney had researched autism after her first encounter with Daniel 2 years ago. She'd learned that every autistic person was different, that Daniel's silence didn't mean emptiness, that his lack of eye contact was sensory overwhelm, not rudeness. She'd noticed patterns, how he covered his ears when voices got too loud, how he calmed when the restaurant's pianist played softer melodies, how music seemed to be the one thing that reached him when nothing else could. But Richard seemed to view autism as a personal failure. Whitney had once overheard him tell a business associate, "We've been through 6 therapists. None of them can fix him." Fix him. As if Daniel were a malfunctioning machine rather than a different kind of mind. The divorce from Rebecca Thornton had happened 2 years ago. Whitney didn't know the details, but she'd heard whispers. Rebecca couldn't stand how Richard treated Daniel, how he hid the boy away at events, how he prioritized business over his son's therapy appointments. Now Daniel lived between 2 homes, mostly raised by a rotating cast of nannies who quit after a few months because Richard's expectations were impossible. What Richard didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Whitney understood children like Daniel in ways that went far beyond observation. 6 years ago, Whitney Davis had been someone entirely different. She'd been a graduate student at Columbia University, pursuing a master's degree in dance movement therapy with a specialization in autism spectrum disorders. She'd been passionate, talented, top of her class. Her professors had called her gifted. "You have a rare intuition," Dr. Patricia Romano had told her. "You understand how bodies communicate when words fail." Whitney had worked evenings at the Riverside Center for Special Needs, helping nonverbal children find expression through movement. She'd developed techniques that combined rhythmic synchronization with improvisational dance, using music to build bridges where language couldn't reach. She'd witnessed breakthrough after breakthrough, children who'd never made eye contact suddenly engaging, kids who'd been self-harming learning to redirect that energy into expressive movement. She'd been 6 months from graduation, already receiving job offers from prestigious therapy centers, when her mother collapsed. Heart attack. Massive and sudden. The medical bills were catastrophic, $150,000 after insurance. Her father had died when Whitney was 16, leaving just her younger sister Jasmine, then 15, and her mother. Someone had to work. Someone had to keep the lights on, pay the bills, keep their mother alive. Whitney had made the choice in one devastating night. She'd withdrawn from Columbia, packed her textbooks, and found the first job with immediate pay and health insurance. The Azure Pearl needed servers. She needed money. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. 6 years later, she was still there. She'd kept one remnant from her old life, a worn textbook on therapeutic movement interventions, hidden in her staff locker. Sometimes on breaks, she'd flip through it, reading about techniques she'd once mastered, remembering the person she used to be. Emma Wilson, the restaurant's 38-year-old manager, was the only person who knew Whitney's story. Emma had found Whitney crying in the staff bathroom during her first year and had somehow coaxed the truth out. Emma had become an ally after that, defending Whitney against difficult customers, giving her the best shifts and keeping her secret. Because in places like the Azure Pearl, having a graduate degree in therapy would make Whitney threatening, overqualified, dangerous to the comfortable hierarchy that said servers should be simple, uncomplicated, easily replaceable. So Whitney stayed invisible. She served champagne to people who never saw her face. She cleared plates for conversations about stocks and summer homes. She existed in the margins of other people's lives, until tonight. Until the jazz pianist began playing an upbeat melody, Duke Ellington's "It Don't Mean a Thing." Until Daniel's body, which had been rigid with tension all evening, suddenly responded to the music. Until the boy stood up, his hands beginning to flap, his body beginning to move, a rare smile breaking across his face. Until he started dancing, and until Whitney made a choice that would change everything. The silence after Richard's shout felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Whitney stumbled backward, releasing Daniel's hands. The boy stopped dancing immediately, his smile vanishing, confusion flooding his face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thornton," Whitney managed, her voice shaking. "He wanted to dance. I didn't mean to." "I don't care what he wanted." Richard cut her off, his voice ice. "You don't touch my son. Ever." He grabbed Daniel's wrist and yanked the boy back toward their table. Daniel made a small sound of distress, and Whitney's heart clenched. Emma Wilson appeared at Whitney's side within seconds. "Mr. Thornton, I apologize for any discomfort, but Daniel approached Whitney, and she was just being kind." "Being kind?" Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter. "She was making a spectacle of my son, dancing with him in front of everyone like he's some kind of—" He stopped himself, but the unsaid words hung heavy in the air. "Like he's some kind of circus act." Richard pulled out his phone. "Get me the owner now. I want this woman fired immediately." Fired. The word hit Whitney like a physical blow. Without this job, she couldn't pay her mother's medical bills, couldn't help with Jasmine's college tuition, couldn't keep their small apartment. "Mr. Thornton, please," Emma tried again. "Whitney is one of our best servers. This is a misunderstanding." "This is assault," Richard snapped. "She put her hands on my disabled son without permission. That's grounds for termination and possibly legal action." Assault. Whitney felt the blood drain from her face. That word could destroy her entire future. Emma's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger, but she was calculating too. Richard Thornton was a major investor in the restaurant. Crossing him could cost Emma her own job. Whitney touched Emma's arm gently. "It's okay. I'll go." But before anyone could move, Daniel started making sounds, low, distressed whimpers that grew louder with each second. His hands began flapping frantically, not with joy this time, but with agitation. "Daniel, stop," Richard said, his voice hard. "We don't do this here." But Daniel couldn't stop. The whimpering turned into rocking. The rocking turned into full-body tension. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Richard grabbed his son's shoulders. "I said stop it! Control yourself!" Whitney recognized what was happening. Daniel was heading toward a meltdown, and Richard's harsh response was only accelerating it. "Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, "You need to leave," Richard snarled. "Now." Then Daniel started screaming, not words, just sound, high-pitched, agonized, desperate. His whole body went rigid and he began hitting his own head with his fists. The elegant gala descended into chaos. Guests pushed back from their tables. Some people pulled out phones. Others looked away, embarrassed or frightened or both. Richard tried to restrain Daniel's arms, but the boy thrashed harder, his screams escalating to a pitch that hurt to hear. "Someone call 911!" Richard shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Do something!" Emma rushed toward Daniel but froze, clearly unsure how to help. The other servers stood paralyzed. Whitney watched from the kitchen doorway, every fiber of her being screaming at her to intervene. She knew what Daniel needed. She knew the exact techniques that could bring him back from the edge. She'd done this dozens of times before, but she'd been fired, called an assailant, told to leave. Daniel's screams grew more desperate. He was hurting himself, and no one knew how to stop it. Whitney looked at Emma. Emma looked back, and something passed between them. Permission, or maybe just desperate hope. Whitney pushed back into the dining room. "I said leave!" Richard shouted when he saw her. But Whitney wasn't listening to him anymore. She was listening to Daniel. As Whitney moved toward the screaming child, memories flooded back with painful clarity. 6 years ago, the Riverside Center, a boy named Marcus. He'd been 5 years old, nonverbal, prone to violent meltdowns that left him bruised and his parents devastated. The center had assigned him to Whitney as her first major case, under Dr. Patricia Romano's supervision. "He needs someone who won't fear his intensity," Dr. Romano had said. "Someone who can meet him in his chaos." Whitney remembered that first session. Marcus had been in the corner screaming and banging his head against the padded wall. Every instinct had told her to back away, call for help, admit she wasn't ready. Instead, she'd sat down 10 feet away from him. She hadn't spoken, hadn't touched him. She'd just begun to move, rocking gently, creating a rhythm with her body, humming a simple melody. For 20 minutes, nothing changed. Then Marcus's screaming fractured slightly, his banging slowed. And then, so gradually Whitney almost missed it, his body began to sway in time with her rhythm. By the end of that first hour, Marcus had crawled over and placed his tiny hand on her knee. No eye contact, no words, but connection. Real, genuine connection. Over 8 months, Whitney had worked with Marcus twice a week. She'd watched him transform from a child trapped in his own distress to a boy who could regulate his emotions, communicate through movement, and eventually speak. The day Marcus had hugged his mother for the first time since his diagnosis, everyone in the therapy room had cried. After Marcus, there had been 11 other children, each one different. Each one teaching her something new about patience, creativity, and the languages bodies speak when words aren't available. Her graduate thesis had focused on something she called rhythmic resonance, the way mirroring a child's movements could create neural pathways for emotional regulation. She'd presented her preliminary findings at a regional conference. Therapy centers from Boston to D.C. had reached out with job offers. Then came the phone call that shattered everything. "Miss Davis, this is Columbia Presbyterian. Your mother has been admitted. You need to come immediately. Cardiac arrest at her cleaning job, emergency surgery. 3 days in ICU." Whitney had sat in the hospital waiting room watching the bill climb on the screen. $50,000, $80,000, $120,000. Their insurance covered barely a third. Her mother survived, but their financial life flatlined. The bills came in waves: hospital, follow-up care, medications that cost $400 per month, physical therapy, home health aides, then Jasmine's school expenses because someone had to keep the 15-year-old on track, then the rent increase they couldn't afford. Whitney had done the math over and over, hoping for different results. Her graduate stipend was $2,000 per month. Rent was $1,800. Her mother's medications alone were $500. The numbers didn't work. They would never work. She remembered the night she withdrew from Columbia. She'd been sitting on her dorm room floor surrounded by textbooks on motor development and trauma therapy, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Dr. Romano had begged her to stay. "We'll find emergency funding. We'll defer your loans. We'll make it work, Whitney. You're too talented to lose." But Whitney had learned something her privileged classmates would never understand. Talent doesn't pay emergency room bills. Passion doesn't keep the lights on. And dreams are a luxury for people who have safety nets. "I have to go," she'd told her mentor, her voice hollow. "My family needs me now, not in 6 months. Now." Packing up her things had felt like dying. Walking past the Riverside Center for the last time, seeing the children through the windows, knowing she was abandoning them, that had felt like something worse than dying. Marcus had cried when she said goodbye. He'd grabbed her hand and said, "Miss Whitney, don't go, please stay." She'd promised him she'd come back. A lie, but a kind one. The Azure Pearl had hired her 3 days later. Good pay, excellent tips, comprehensive health insurance that covered pre-existing conditions, everything she needed and nothing she wanted. For 6 years, she'd buried that part of herself. She'd told herself it was temporary. She'd promised herself she'd go back to school someday, but someday had a way of never arriving. Until tonight. Until Daniel danced with her and then melted down. Until Whitney realized that some skills don't disappear, they just wait for the moment you need them most. She knelt down 3 feet from the screaming child and began to hum. Whitney positioned herself carefully, close enough to be present, far enough not to overwhelm. Daniel was in full crisis now, screaming and hitting himself, his whole body locked in distress. "Get away from him!" Richard shouted again, but a new voice cut through the chaos. "Let her work." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, Dr. Sarah Bennett, mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair and an air of unshakable authority. "I'm a licensed child psychologist, Mr. Thornton. What she's doing is called therapeutic intervention. Let her continue." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Dr. Bennett's tone left no room for debate. Whitney began to hum, low and steady, the same jazz melody that had made Daniel dance earlier. "It don't mean a thing." She let the sound carry through his screaming, not competing with it, just offering an alternative. Daniel's body shifted slightly. Somewhere beneath the panic, he heard it. Whitney began to rock, gentle and rhythmic, matching the tempo of the music in her mind. Her hands moved in small, repetitive patterns, not reaching toward Daniel, just creating a visual rhythm in the space between them. "What is she doing?" someone in the crowd whispered. Dr. Bennett answered quietly but clearly. "She's offering him co-regulation. His nervous system is in fight or flight. She's showing him a pathway back to calm." Whitney started speaking, her voice soft and steady beneath the screaming. "Daniel, the music is still here. Remember how we danced? Remember how good that felt?" The screaming fractured slightly. Not stopped, but changed. "The music doesn't stop just because things got scary," Whitney continued. "It's still playing. Can you hear it?" She began tapping a rhythm on her own knees, the same rhythm Daniel had moved to when they danced. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Daniel's hitting slowed, his screams reduced to ragged sobs. Whitney kept tapping. "You were so happy when we danced. You showed me how you hear music. Your body knows how to move. Your body knows how to feel good." She started incorporating small movements, a gentle sway, a soft hand gesture, echoes of their brief dance together, and then miraculously, Daniel's right hand twitched, once, twice, trying to copy her rhythm. "That's it," Whitney whispered. "You're remembering. You're in control. You decide when to move. You decide the rhythm." She slowed her movements even more, making each gesture deliberate and clear. Daniel's hand began to tap against his own leg. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. His rigid body began to soften. His breathing, which had been shallow and panicked, started to deepen. His eyes, wild and unfocused moments ago, began tracking Whitney's movements. The restaurant had gone silent except for Whitney's humming and Daniel's gradually quieting sobs. "When you're ready, only when you're ready, you can look at me," Whitney said gently. "Remember how we looked at each other when we danced? How safe that felt?" 5 seconds, 10, 20, then Daniel's eyes found hers. Brief contact, then away, then back. Recognition. "Hi, Daniel," Whitney said softly. "I see you. I'm still here." The boy's tapping continued. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Whitney slowly began to sway again, echoing their dance from before, but smaller now, gentler, non-threatening. Want to remember how we moved together? How good the music felt? Daniel hesitated. His body was still trembling from the aftermath of the meltdown, but his screaming had stopped. His self-injury had stopped. Slowly, carefully, Daniel began to sway, just a little, matching Whitney's rhythm. Whitney's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. That's beautiful, Daniel. You're dancing again. Even after everything got scary, you remembered how to dance. She began to stand, moving very slowly, and extended her hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Daniel looked at her hand, then at her face. Then, with deliberate intent, he reached out and took it. They swayed together, both humming now, both moving to the same internal music. It wasn't the joyful, spontaneous dance from before. This was quieter, more tender, a dance of recovery. The room exhaled collectively. Several guests wiped their eyes. Dr. Bennett stepped closer, her professional composure cracking. Mr. Thornton, do you see what just happened? Your son was in severe crisis, hurting himself, completely dysregulated. Miss Davis brought him back in under 5 minutes using advanced therapeutic techniques. She turned to Whitney. Where did you train? This was it, the moment where everything changed. Whitney kept her eyes on Daniel, still swaying with him. Columbia University, Dance Movement Therapy Program. I specialized in autism intervention. The murmuring began immediately. Emma Wilson stepped forward, her voice clear and proud. Whitney Davis was pursuing her master's degree in therapeutic movement for special needs children. She was top of her class. She withdrew to take care of her sick mother. The murmuring grew louder. Richard Thornton stood frozen, watching his son, calm now, connected now, safe now, in the arms of the woman he'd just tried to fire. You're a therapist? Richard's voice was barely audible. You've been serving my table for 3 years and you're a trained therapist? Whitney finally looked at him. I was a therapist. I became a server because that's what survival required, and you never saw me as anything else. Daniel squeezed her hand and leaned against her side. The restaurant erupted in applause. Dr. Sarah Bennett moved closer to Whitney and Daniel, her trained eyes taking in every detail. What you just demonstrated is called trauma-informed crisis intervention combined with somatic regulation. I've been a clinical psychologist for 23 years, and I've seen board-certified therapists fail at exactly what you just accomplished. She addressed the crowd, her voice carrying professional authority. That wasn't luck or natural talent. That was training, expertise, and genuine understanding of neurodevelopmental disorders. Richard Thornton's face had gone pale. He looked at his son, calm now, holding Whitney's hand, humming softly, and then at Whitney, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? All those times you served our table. Would you have listened? Whitney asked quietly. Or would you have just seen another server getting above her station? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of discomfort spreading through the crowd. Emma pulled out her phone. With your permission, Whitney, I'm going to read something. She navigated to a saved screenshot. This is Whitney's academic transcript from Columbia, Dance Movement Therapy Program, GPA 4.0. Research focus, rhythmic synchronization in autism spectrum disorders. Faculty recommendation. Miss Davis demonstrates extraordinary capacity to connect with nonverbal children. Her intuitive understanding, combined with theoretical rigor, makes her one of the most promising therapists we've trained. Emma looked at Richard. She didn't fail. She sacrificed her future to save her mother's life. That's called love, Mr. Thornton. Not failure. Not... Richard's hands were shaking. 3 years. I've spent 3 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars searching for someone who could help Daniel. 6 different therapists. None of them could reach him like this. And you were right there. I was invisible, Whitney corrected. I served your wine. I cleared your plates. I existed only as a function, not as a person. Dr. Bennett cleared her throat. Mr. Thornton, I don't typically make unsolicited professional recommendations, but I'm making an exception now. Your son just experienced a severe meltdown in a triggering environment and recovered in under 5 minutes. That's clinically extraordinary. Most children take 30 minutes to hours to recover from that level of dysregulation. She gestured to Daniel, who was now sitting calmly at Whitney's feet. still holding her hand. More importantly, your son has connected with Miss Davis twice tonight, in ways he hasn't connected with anyone else. That kind of therapeutic rapport is rare and precious. You'd be foolish to ignore it. Richard ran his hand through his silver hair, and for the first time, Whitney saw something other than arrogance in his expression. She saw fear, desperation, the face of a father who'd been failing his son and knew it. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting you set aside your prejudice long enough to see an opportunity," Dr. Bennett said bluntly. "Miss Davis has the training, the skill, and clearly the rapport with Daniel. The question is whether your ego matters more than your son's well-being." Silence hung heavy in the air. Every guest was watching, waiting. Finally, Richard spoke. "Prove it." He pulled out his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "I'm setting up a contract right now. Work with Daniel for 30 days. If you can help him, genuinely help him make measurable progress, I'll transfer $100,000 to your account. Plus, I'll fund your return to Columbia to complete your degree. Full tuition, full living expenses." Whitney's breath caught. $100,000 would erase her mother's medical debt, pay for Jasmine's college, change everything. But Richard wasn't finished. His voice took on a harder edge. "However, when you fail, and you will fail, just like all the others, you'll admit publicly that you were playing pretend with some college courses. That real expertise takes more than book learning, and you'll resign from this restaurant with no severance, no references." The cruelty of the terms was stunning. This wasn't about Daniel. This was about Richard protecting his ego, setting up a scenario where he couldn't lose. Emma stepped forward. "That's not fair, Mr. Thornton. You're rigging this to—" "I accept," Whitney interrupted. Emma turned to her, eyes wide with alarm. "Whitney, you don't have to—" "I accept," Whitney repeated, looking directly at Richard. "But not because of your money or your power. I accept because Daniel deserves someone who actually sees him, someone who doesn't think he's broken, someone who understands that autism isn't a disease to cure. It's a different way of being in the world." She squeezed Daniel's hand gently. "I'll work with your son. I'll help him find his voice. And maybe, if you're capable of growth, I'll help you understand the boy you've been ignoring." The restaurant erupted in whispers. Phones appeared, people recording, texting, posting. Dr. Bennett stepped forward. "I'll volunteer as clinical supervisor. Monthly evaluations, documented progress, official assessments. This will be legitimate therapeutic intervention, Mr. Thornton, not some performance for your ego." Richard nodded stiffly. "Fine, 30 days, starting tomorrow morning." He looked at Daniel, who was leaning contentedly against Whitney's leg, humming the jazz melody. Something in Richard's expression cracked, vulnerability showing through the armor. "Don't hurt him," he said quietly. And for once he didn't sound like a billionaire issuing commands. He sounded like a scared father. "Please, he's been through enough." Whitney met his eyes. "The person who's been hurting him is you, Mr. Thornton. I'll help Daniel, but you need to stop damaging what I'm trying to heal." The words were delivered calmly, without malice, but they struck like a physical blow. Richard flinched, but said nothing. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving his son with the black server he'd tried to destroy an hour earlier. As the crowd dispersed, Emma hugged Whitney tightly. "You just agreed to the impossible." Whitney looked down at Daniel, who smiled up at her. "No," she said. "I just agreed to do what I was always meant to do." By the time Whitney got home that night at 11:45 p.m., her phone was on fire. Someone at the gala had filmed the entire incident. Richard's initial outburst, the dancing moment, Daniel's meltdown, Whitney's intervention, and the confrontation. It had been uploaded to Twitter at 9:17 p.m. with the caption, "Billionaire humiliates black server for dancing with his autistic son, then discovers she's a trained therapist. What happens next will shock you." Within 3 hours, 500,000 views. By morning, 3 million. By noon the next day, 12 million. Whitney sat at her tiny kitchen table, her mother across from her, both staring at the phone in disbelief. "Baby, there are news vans outside," her mother said, peeking through the curtain. "CNN, ABC, NBC, local news, they all want interviews." Whitney's phone rang. Again. She'd stopped answering after the 30th call, but this number looked familiar. She picked up. "Miss Davis? This is Dr. Patricia Romano from Columbia." Whitney's heart stopped. Her former mentor, the woman whose disappointment had haunted her for 6 years. Dr. Romano, I watched the video. Her mentor's voice was thick with emotion. Whitney, what you did last night was extraordinary. The technique, the timing, the rapport building, it was flawless, and you did it under hostile conditions without clinical support. Whitney couldn't speak. The department chair called an emergency meeting this morning. We want you back. Full scholarship for your remaining semester. Retroactive credit for all completed coursework. You could graduate in 4 months. The words felt unreal. But Dr. Romano, the tuition, the living expenses, 5 therapy foundations have already contacted us offering full sponsorship. Whitney, you've become a symbol of something people desperately need to see. Talented people made invisible by circumstance, by class, by race. Everyone wants to help you finish what you started. After the call ended, Whitney sat in stunned silence. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Turn on Good Morning America now. Whitney grabbed the remote. On screen, the anchors were discussing the viral video. This story has captivated millions, the host said. A black woman working as a server, hiding an advanced degree in therapy, stepped in to help a billionaire's disabled son after that same billionaire had just publicly humiliated her. The national conversation this has sparked about class, race, and invisible talent is extraordinary. The segment featured interviews with other service workers sharing their hidden credentials. A janitor who'd been a civil engineer, a barista with a PhD in literature, a delivery driver who'd been a concert violinist. The narrative was expanding. This wasn't just about Whitney anymore. Another text from an unknown number. This is Rebecca Thornton, Daniel's mother. Thank you for seeing my son when his father couldn't. I'll support your work with him however I can. Please don't give up on Daniel. Then Emma again. Restaurant owner called. Richard tried to pressure him to fire you. Owner refused. Said you're now the most famous employee we've ever had. You're safe. Your job is protected. Whitney's mother squeezed her hand, tears streaming down her face. Your daddy would be so proud, baby, so proud. The hashtag #justice for Whitney was trending. So was #invisible talent and #dance therapy. But Whitney wasn't thinking about the fame or the scholarship offers or even the viral video. She was thinking about Daniel, about the promise she'd made, about 30 days to help a child who desperately needed someone to see him. The whole world would be watching. But the only eyes that mattered were Daniel's. The demonstration took place at the Riverside Center for Special Needs, Whitney's former workplace, in a large sunlit studio with mirrors along one wall and observation windows for families and professionals. 180 people packed the viewing area. Parents, therapists, reporters, and Richard Thornton sitting in the front row with his ex-wife, Rebecca. Richard had insisted on a public demonstration. He wanted proof, clinical validation, and likely, Whitney suspected, one final opportunity to prove she'd fail. Dr. Sarah Bennett stood before the crowd, clinical assessment forms in hand. Over the past 30 days, I've conducted weekly evaluations of Daniel Thornton's progress under Miss Davis's therapeutic care. Today's demonstration will showcase the results of that intensive intervention. Whitney entered with Daniel. The 8-year-old still avoided direct eye contact with most people, but his hand was relaxed in hers. He wore comfortable clothes and his body language was calm, open. When Daniel began therapy with Miss Davis, Dr. Bennett explained, he was largely nonverbal in stressful situations, prone to severe meltdowns averaging 45 minutes in duration, and had significant difficulty with emotional regulation and social connection. He'd been through 6 therapists in 2 years with minimal documented progress. She paused for effect. I'm going to show you what 30 days of proper therapeutic intervention can accomplish. Whitney led Daniel to the center of the studio. The jazz piano began playing It Don't Mean a Thing, the song from that first night. Daniel's face lit up immediately. Without prompting, he began to move. But this wasn't the chaotic, uncontrolled movement from 30 days ago. This was deliberate, expressive, beautiful. Whitney moved with him, and they danced together, a conversation without words. She led, he followed. He improvised, she mirrored. It was connection made visible. What you're seeing is called therapeutic synchrony, Dr. Bennett narrated. Daniel has learned to use movement as a language for emotions he can't always verbalize. Watch his breathing. See how regulated it is? That's a learned skill. After 2 minutes of dancing, Whitney slowed the movement and addressed the audience while keeping Daniel engaged. "We've been working on emotional identification through physical expression," she explained. She demonstrated several movements, arms wrapped tight for scared, hands over heart for happy, arms reaching up for excited. "Daniel," she said gently, "can you show everyone how you feel right now?" The room went silent. Daniel stopped dancing. He stood still, and Whitney could feel the collective holding of breath from the audience. Then, deliberately, Daniel placed both hands over his heart. "Happy." The crowd gasped softly, but Whitney wasn't finished. "Can you tell us with words, Daniel? Can you use your voice?" Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I feel..." His voice was small but clear. "I feel safe with Miss Whitney." The observation room erupted in quiet applause, but Daniel wasn't done. He turned toward the window where his parents sat. His eyes found his father. "Daddy?" Daniel's voice was stronger now. "Will you dance with me?" Richard's face crumpled. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he stood and walked to the door leading into the studio. He entered slowly, uncertain, and knelt in front of his son. "I would love to dance with you, buddy," Richard whispered. Daniel took his father's hands and began to sway, humming the jazz melody. Richard followed his son's lead, crying openly. After 30 seconds, Daniel said the words that broke everyone in the room. "I'm not broken, Daddy. Miss Whitney taught me. I'm just different." Then Daniel wrapped his arms around his father's neck. Richard sobbed, holding his son, finally seeing him. Dr. Bennett's voice was thick with emotion as she addressed the crowd. "What you just witnessed is clinically significant progress across multiple domains: emotional regulation, verbal expression, social initiation, and perhaps most importantly, self-advocacy. This is not a miracle. This is what happens when a child receives proper therapeutic intervention from someone who truly understands them." She turned to Richard, who was still holding Daniel. "Mr. Thornton, your son was never broken. He just needed someone who spoke his language." 2 hours after the demonstration, Richard requested a private meeting with Whitney. They sat in a small conference room at the Riverside Center, Dr. Bennett present as mediator, while Daniel played happily with sensory toys in an adjacent room under Rebecca's supervision. Richard looked diminished somehow, older, smaller. "I need to apologize to you," he began, his voice unsteady. "Multiple apologies, actually, for multiple cruelties." Whitney waited, saying nothing. "I called you filthy. I told you to know your place. I tried to get you fired. I accused you of assault." He shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. "And you responded by saving my son." "I didn't save him," Whitney corrected gently. "I helped him access what was already inside him. Daniel was never the problem, Mr. Thornton. I was the problem." "Yes." The bluntness of it seemed to physically hurt him. "Why?" His voice cracked. "After what I did to you, why did you help Daniel?" Whitney thought carefully before responding. "Because children don't deserve to suffer for their parents' failures. Because I know what it's like to be invisible. And because I remember what it feels like when someone finally sees you." She leaned forward. "Can I ask you something honest? When you looked at me that night at the Azure Pearl, what did you see?" Richard's jaw clenched. I saw a black woman in a uniform. Someone beneath me. Someone whose only value was serving me. You saw a function, not a person." "Function?" "Yes." "And when you looked at Daniel, what did you see?" Richard's hands trembled. "I saw my failure. I saw something I couldn't control or fix or make acceptable to my peers. I saw..." He stopped, his voice breaking. "I saw my shame reflected back at me." "And that," Whitney said quietly, "is the real tragedy. You were so ashamed of Daniel's autism that you forgot to love him for who he is. You hired therapists not to help Daniel, but to erase the parts of him that embarrassed you." "God." Richard put his face in his hands. "What kind of father does that?" Dr. Bennett spoke up. "A father who's been conditioned by a society that values conformity over authenticity. But acknowledging harm is only the first step, Mr. Thornton. The question is, what will you do differently?" Richard looked up, his eyes red and desperate. "Tell me, please, tell me what to do." "First, Whitney said firmly. You apologize to Daniel. Really apologize. Tell him he's not broken. Tell him his autism isn't something to fix. Tell him you were wrong. I will. Today. Second, you start learning about autism from autistic adults, not just from professionals. Read their words. Listen to their experiences. Understand that Daniel's neurodevelopment isn't a tragedy. It's just a different way of being human. Richard pulled out his phone, taking notes. Third, Whitney continued, you address your own prejudice. What you did to me wasn't isolated. You've treated service workers, people of color, anyone you deemed beneath you with contempt. That pattern has to end. It will, I promise. And fourth, most important, you spend actual time with your son, not managing him, not fixing him, just being with him, learning who he is when you're not trying to change him. Richard looked through the window at Daniel, who was lining up colored blocks with focused concentration. I don't know how to just be with him. Then learn, Whitney said simply. The same way Daniel is learning to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. With patience, with humility, with the willingness to be uncomfortable and make mistakes. Richard stood, walked to the window, pressed his hand against the glass. Miss Davis, I don't deserve your grace, but thank you for seeing my son, for not giving up on him when I had. Whitney joined him at the window. I didn't do it for you. I did it for Daniel, and for every person who's ever been told they don't matter. They matter, Richard said quietly. You've taught me that. Finally. Good, Whitney said. Now go dance with your son. 6 months later, Whitney Davis stood in Columbia University's graduation hall, wearing her cap and gown, finally ready to receive the degree she'd sacrificed 6 years ago. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Her cohort, yes, but also journalists, therapists from across the country, and dozens of families whose children had been touched by her story and her work. In the front row sat her mother, healthy and radiant, beside her sister Jasmine, now thriving at NYU. Emma Wilson was there, beaming with pride, along with staff from the Azure Pearl who'd pooled money to buy flowers. And in the third row, looking slightly out of place but genuinely present, sat Richard Thornton, beside his ex-wife Rebecca, with Daniel between them. Dean Patricia Romano approached the podium. Today we celebrate the graduation of a student whose journey reminds us why this work matters. Whitney Davis left us 6 years ago to care for her family, a choice that embodied the very compassion and sacrifice that makes her an exceptional therapist. Today, she returns to claim the degree she earned through dedication, brilliance, and extraordinary character. The audience rose as Whitney walked across the stage, finally receiving her master's in dance movement therapy with highest honors. But Dean Romano had one more announcement. Miss Davis, your intervention with Daniel Thornton sparked a national conversation about hidden talent, about systemic barriers, and about the price of survival for working-class students of color. In recognition of your impact, we're honored to announce the establishment of the Whitney Davis Opportunity Fellowship. Whitney's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Richard Thornton has endowed this fellowship with $5 million. It will provide full scholarships, living expenses, child care support, and emergency family assistance to students from low-income backgrounds pursuing degrees in therapeutic and social service fields. No student should ever have to choose between education and survival again. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Richard approached the microphone, visibly nervous. I'm not accustomed to admitting when I'm wrong, but 6 months ago I was catastrophically wrong. I humiliated a woman publicly because she showed kindness to my son. I saw her skin color and her uniform before I saw her humanity, her expertise, her worth. His voice shook. Whitney Davis gave me back my relationship with my son, but more than that, she forced me to see my own bigotry, my own cruelty, my own profound failure as both a father and a human being. This fellowship isn't about redemption. I'm not sure I deserve that. It's about ensuring that talented, compassionate people like Whitney never have to sacrifice their calling because society refuses to see their value. He turned to Whitney. Thank you for teaching me that seeing people, truly seeing them, is the foundation of everything good in this world. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, Daniel ran up to Whitney and hugged her tight. Miss Whitney, I sat still the whole time, and I only stimmed twice. You were perfect, Whitney said, kneeling. I'm so proud of you. Dad's taking me to a jazz concert next week, a real one, with live music. Daniel's words flowed easily now, his progress remarkable. Will you come? I wouldn't miss it. Richard approached, Rebecca beside him. They looked like partners now, not enemies, united in their commitment to Daniel. We're co-parenting successfully, Rebecca said quietly. Both in family therapy, both learning, both grateful. And I've been volunteering at the Riverside Center, Richard added. Not just writing checks, actually spending time with the children, learning from them. Whitney studied him. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was real. How does it feel? Uncomfortable, Richard admitted, but necessary. I'm learning that discomfort is where growth happens. A text arrived on Whitney's phone. Dr. Bennett, job offer official, Director of Dance Movement Therapy, Riverside Center, $120, 000 year. Your program, your vision. Say yes. Whitney stared at the message. Director. The position she'd dreamed about since she was 22. Her mother appeared at her side. What is it, baby? Whitney showed her. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Whitney, your father is watching. I know he is. That evening, Whitney sat in her new apartment, the one with space and light and a view of actual trees, and opened her laptop. She typed to Dr. Bennett. I accept. When do I start? Then she pulled out a fresh journal and began writing. Not therapy notes, but a memoir. She wanted to document this journey, from invisible to visible, from silenced to heard, from dismissed to valued. She wanted other people with buried dreams to know it's not too late. The last entry she wrote that night was a dedication. For Daniel, who taught me that being different is beautiful. For my mother, who showed me that love requires sacrifice. For Emma, who believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. For Dr. Romano, who never gave up on her student. And for every server, janitor, cashier, driver, every person made invisible by circumstance. This is proof that you matter. Your talent matters. Your dreams matter. You matter. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. 6 months ago, Whitney Davis had been invisible, serving champagne to people who never saw her face. Today, she was seen, celebrated, empowered. Tomorrow, she would open the doors of opportunity for others, because healing isn't just about individuals, it's about systems. It's about seeing people. It's about building a world where talent isn't wasted because of poverty, where dreams don't die because of medical bills, where a person's worth isn't determined by their uniform or their skin color. One person at a time, one dance at a time, one moment of genuine connection at a time. That's how change happens. If this story moved you, don't just watch. Take action. Like this video if you believe talent has no color and no class. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their dreams still matter. Subscribe for more stories about invisible heroes who change the world. And comment below, have you ever had to sacrifice your dreams for your family? Have you ever been invisible? Your story matters. We're listening.